Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. I want to thank the whole team at DLN for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back in New York, where I haven't been in quite some time. I also want to thank them for allowing them to invite my daughter along with me, Cameron, who's just graduated with a degree in fashion marketing and is interested in starting a career here, just moved here a couple of weeks ago. So if you've got leads, it'd be great. She'd be in forever debt to her father, so that would be awesome. Do say hi to Cameron if you get a chance today. So it's great to be here to talk about artificial intelligence. It's a topic on everybody's lips these days. It's the hottest policy issue on the technology front I've covered in 34 years of doing emerging technology policy for a variety of academic institutions and think tanks like the one I'm at now. I like to say that AI is essentially eating the world. It's eating the world of economics and business, of society and social interactions, and of policy. In fact, just to give you a flavor for how interested public policymakers are in this issue, in the first 4 months of 2025, we have seen over 1,000 AI-related bills introduced in the United States. 1,000. That is completely unprecedented. Again, in my entire 3+ decades of doing tech, we've never seen anything like that. But that kind of makes sense, right? Because, of course, it does touch every single facet of society and economy. I've already testified this year 7 times. I got another one coming next month. I've never been invited to speak that much anytime in my life, so it's both a pleasure and a little bit of a curse because it's just nonstop pressure on the policy side. Why is everybody so focused on artificial intelligence, though? Well, it's really because AI is part of really 2 revolutions. Broad-based computational revolution is one. When we talk about AI, it's really part of a revolution in data science, data analytics, crypto, quantum computing, and so on, but really it's born of the internet and digital and e-commerce revolution. We wouldn't be talking about AI without the internet revolution that came before it. And that's really important from a policy perspective because all of the baggage of the internet policy and e-commerce wars is now going to come to bear on the AI policy world in many different ways for business, society, and so on. Especially on the societal side, things like social media's influence on society just spills over into debate about AI's influence on society. And so we can expect to see a lot of tension coming out of that. When we think about AI policy and how it's playing out right now in the world, we could think about 4 different types of layers where it's playing out jurisdictionally and 4 different types of general AI policy. In terms of the layers, it's pretty straightforward: federal, state, local, and then international. And when I mention those 1,000 bills that are pending in the United States right now, the vast majority of them are state and local bills. So this creates a lot of confusion and complexity. And going back to the word of the day, our previous 2 speakers talked about uncertainties. Lots and lots of uncertainties in the field of artificial intelligence policy when you have that many lawmakers trying to engage in a regulation of an emerging technology. And then you add the international overlay. The European Union already has an AI Act that it's looking to implement, and many, many other countries across the globe are looking at a piece of the action, including countries that don't really have a major play in artificial intelligence but are interested in regulating American technology companies. So those are sort of 4 layers. But what about the 4 buckets or types of AI policy? Well, I'm going to oversimplify here to keep the conversation straightforward, but basically you have efforts, first of all, to regulate at the sort of model level, like broad-based AI models. You're all familiar with OpenAI by now, ChatGPT, things like Anthropic, models from Google, from Facebook, so on and so forth. There is an effort to regulate the sort of computational power or complexity of those models, again, at the state level and at the federal level. Very confusing, but that's a big part of AI regulation today. We're waiting to see what plays out on that front right now. There's a concern, however, about the use side of AI and how AI will it be fair and non-discriminatory. So there's a huge flurry of legislative activity, most of it driven at the state level, to try to make sure we regulate AI and algorithms preemptively to make sure they're fair, non-discriminatory, unbiased, things like that. That's a huge volume of activity. But then there's another bucket. There's a whole sectoral bucket of AI and fill-in-the-blank bills. AI and healthcare, AI and transportation, AI and fintech, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there's another bucket, which is more like AI promotional efforts, or studying the issue and finding ways to build out AI capacity. Again, state and federal level. And so you have, again, a lot of uncertainty about how all of that activity is going to get done, or if any of it will get done. But again, a lot is moving. Now, getting more to concerns that might affect your industry and your professions. There's a lot of cross-cutting concerns about AI. When you think about how AI might affect national security and like the concerns about how China might race ahead on AI, get out in front of the United States, that's a huge driver of public policy concern today, especially at the federal level. Several of my recent testimonies have just been on that issue of like, is China not only catching up, but maybe ready to leapfrog the United States? People talk about the DeepSeek moment. Among the many different Chinese models that have been created, these large ones from DeepSeek and Alibaba and others have become very dominant globally and are competing aggressively against the United States. That really concerns policymakers and some people in the business world. But there are other issues involving AI and fill in the blank. AI and elections, AI and misinformation, AI and education, AI and government agencies and their various uses, whether it's policing or whatever else. AI and kid safety, a huge driver of concern about whether or not AI will have an influence on youth the same way social media has. But obviously for your sector and many of the businesses that you work for or run, there's really two huge drivers that I think concern you and many, many other people in industry. One is intellectual property, and I know we're going to hear more about that later today, so I won't go on at length, but I can tell you that much like the internet revolution, we saw a major driver of regulation of the internet be intellectual property. And so there were carve-outs to the fact that, for the most part, the United States had a relatively light touch policy regime for e-commerce and internet transactions that the Clinton administration formed with Congress back in the 1990s that I was involved with. Well, the difference was that IP had to be sort of carved out and changed to be different than the rest of everything else. And that's the way I think it's probably going to go for AI as well. And we'll have a special set of rules for AI. And this is, of course, being litigated right now in an aggressive way. But again, we'll hear more about that later today. But let me get into the bigger one, jobs. Jobs and sectoral transformations or disruptions. Throughout the history of automation, going way, way, way back, hundreds of years, concerns about how machines might disrupt labor, professions, skills, industries, and business has been a primary driver of opposition to technology and technological change. I've written extensively about this across my 10 really ridiculously boring books that I wouldn't recommend anybody read. But this has been a fundamental driver of concern among policymakers at both parties, everywhere in the world. And it makes sense, because there's no doubt about it. Technology does disrupt sectors, jobs, professions, skills, and more. But let me tell you a couple stories about maybe some causes for optimism, because there's plenty of causes for pessimism. And I do, again, admit there's going to be sectoral disruptions. Let me tell you stories going back 10 years, 40 years, and then 60. 10 years ago, there were many, many people who predicted in academic studies and people who were engaged in AI development that there would be no need for radiologists in our modern world. One of the most important AI developers who won a prize for his work in AI said that anybody studying to be a radiologist 10 years ago should just quit, should just stop, because the machines are going to take that all over. I encourage you to read a New York Times article written 2 weeks ago about how there's more radiologists than ever before. They're actively using AI, and it's supplementing their jobs, and they found a way to utilize it in a sort of complex human-machine interaction way to improve their profession. It freed up time for them to do things other than just staring at a certain type of X-ray and saying, well, what do we think? Now the machines can do that, and they can do other things. That's similar to this story if we walk 40 years back about what happened to automation in the fintech sector, and specifically banking. There was a lot of fears when I was growing up that the rise of ATM machines would wipe out bank tellers. And in a way they did. You know, bank tellers used to sit there and hand us cash, reel off bills. Nobody does that anymore, right? You just go up to a machine, you get your money, if you get cash at all. You don't need cash for the most part. Things changed. But we have more people employed in the fintech sector now and doing things that they were not able to do before, creating unique financial instruments, taking on jobs and responsibilities that only became possible after their time was freed up from the boring, mundane task of just handing out cash at a cash register at a bank window, rather. And so that's another story. Going back even further in time, late 50s, early 60s, there was an entire profession of humans called calculators. These were the smart math nerds that basically sat at a chalkboard and did all the hard math for government, for academics, and for business. The mathematically inclined people. They then saw their jobs wiped out by the rise of mainframe computers. All of a sudden, when we talked about calculators, we talked about machines that could do the computations. And then we had pocket calculators, right? And then the whole world changed, spreadsheets and everything else. But that's not the end of the story. What's remarkable about what happened back then is that the people we used to call human calculators, once they were no longer standing in front of chalkboards, had their time freed up to get behind the machines and create the personal computing revolution. They gave America the great revolution in computation that became computing, that became the internet, because they had their minds and abilities freed up to do these things. Now, that doesn't mean that change in any of these sectors, radiology, banking, computation, were easy for anyone involved. There were really tough transitions, and there's going to be even tougher ones today because of the rise of AI. There's no doubt about it. But I'm optimistic about humanity's ability to sort of prevail when we're confronted with technological change and find creative ways to capitalize on it. But because AI will affect almost every layer of your value chain, and it really demands your attention across the full stack, those companies and individuals that are willing to seize upon these new skills and this new revolution are going to benefit first. And so where do we stand, though, policy-wise on that question? This is a great unifier of policy concern. Plenty of Democrats, plenty of Republicans and independents, all are concerned about the impact of technology, and AI in particular, on jobs. We've seen proposals to have all sorts of restrictions, maybe by sector or maybe broad-based on how AI could be utilized in certain sectors. We've also seen proposals for things like robot taxes or automation taxes, where if you automate a certain percentage of your business, you maybe have to pay more into a fund to pay out to workers who've been displaced, however that would work. There have been many people who proposed that, including Bill de Blasio when he was mayor here, when he was running for president, proposed the idea of an federal automation commission that would review every automation decision by business or industry to figure out, is this fair, just? Have workers been displaced? That's going to be really, really hard, but a lot of people favor that idea. But the bottom line is that this is going to become a dominant concern for many, many different people in many different parties, and I can assure you that this is going to become something we talk about in political elections more and more with each passing day. So I've talked a lot here. I'll just leave you with a few thoughts about where we're heading on this, policy-wise. Regulation is coming. I mentioned the 1,000 bills. Not all of them have passed, but a lot have. A lot of the state ones are passing, and they've concerned the federal authorities enough that our Congress has actually floated the idea of a 10-year moratorium on new AI regulation by state and local governments, AI-specific things. Not all technology regulation, but AI-specific regulatory efforts like the ones I mentioned. It's a hugely controversial idea, but I think it actually has some merit because the complexity and the compliance costs for businesses associated with trying to figure out how to comply with all of those different jurisdictional layers of AI regulations. And then on top of that, you're confronted with the international scene where you've got the European Union and the so-called Brussels effect of them trying to apply their policy to the entire planet. And that Brussels effect problem has already been a problem in the world of data collection and data use and privacy, where laws like the GDPR and other EU acts have really burdened American businesses, especially smaller ones. That's going to be part of a broad debate in Congress this year and next about what are we going to do about so-called baseline comprehensive artificial intelligence regulation or policy. And that's going to piggyback on top of an effort to still deal with the privacy issue, the data collection, data use question, which affects your industry and so many others. Because information, of course, is a very powerful, important thing to fueling the success of many different sectors, but it's also something that creates enormous tensions and controversies with a lot of different people because of fears about excessive data collection or use. So stay tuned on that front. Those things are happening. Meanwhile, the Trump administration is trying to go at it alone on a lot of this stuff. Going back to what our previous speakers said, there's a lot of aggressive unilateral efforts by the executive branch to sort of play king for the day or maybe the year and just try to do a lot of things through executive orders or other types of mechanisms to affect public policy towards artificial intelligence and data more generally. So that makes for a lot of, again, confusion and uncertainty about what happens with AI policy for your industry and every other going forward. But I can tell you this, that this is not going away. I expect that this will become the fundamental driver of all technology policy in Congress for many, many years to come, and probably one that will start to dominate more time in elections. So let me leave it there and then turn to you if you have any questions for me about where things stand on AI for your industry, but also more broadly in the world of policy. One over here.
Hi, I'm from Los Angeles, and then we're experimenting with AI permitting right now. And from my understanding is that this LADBS can't seem to get it to work so far. And what I'm more worried about is that, so now this is governmental AI collection, data collection. How could we protect ourselves as architects?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're going to see in coming years is the marriage of the digital privacy concerns and the AI use concerns, like how various types of information, private, personal, or otherwise, might be utilized by either industry or the government, in this case, a permitting process, which is really interesting. I'd like to hope that like AI can really help solve a lot of permitting problems, actually make things more streamlined and efficient. The last testimony I did in front of the House Oversight Committee was all about this question, about how we can actually utilize AI to improve government processes, bring down costs, and make for a better user experience, in this case, the public citizen experience. That being said, there's always going to be this tension about like how far we should allow government to go with these tools. It gets even touchier when you get into like law enforcement matters, as you can imagine, about how much access we give government to data to do collated sets of like, you know, cross-sectional reports and like figure out, you know, who's a criminal, and that gets really creepy and scary. And there's been laws to try to address that. But what you're talking about is sort of uncharted territory. A lot of governments doing different types of experiments in this regard, including some that are experimenting with the idea of what's called regulatory sandboxes for AI and other tech. A sandbox in the policy sense means you go to a legislature and you get essentially a special operational permit to do something unique that might otherwise conflict with existing law, but you're able to do it within the confines of this so-called sandbox on a special, you know, permitting basis of some sort. I don't know how it's working in California in that regard. I'm sure it's very complex out there. I think there's currently 78 bills pending in California alone. There's 130 or 40 here in New York. So there's just so much going on, it's hard for me to keep track of it all. I apologize. Any questions? Right up front here.
I have a question about your comment about the 10-year moratorium. Mm-hmm. It feels like there is so much going on in the AI world, and there does need to be some regulation. I'm wondering why, number one, where the 10-year thing came. 10 years is a very long time, mm-hmm. and why you think that's a good idea.
Well, we need to have some sort of normalcy brought to the market for AI policy, just as we had for the internet. The internet, for the most part, was born into an era, I like to say the internet was born free. It was born into an era where we didn't have a lot of existing regulation, and so the internet was given a wide berth to go out, and people were able to do interesting things in the world of e-commerce and digital economics. Not so for AI. There's a lot of now existing regulations that are compounding, and then there's all new AI regulations. At some point, the complexities for business become overwhelming, and really only very, very large businesses can actually afford to comply with it, because most small and mid-sized entrepreneurs, they just don't have large compliance teams. They don't have, like, you know, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, thousands of people working on their legal, you know, team. Their legal shop is like, you know, the husband or wife sitting in a garage trying to figure it all out at the end of the evening. So at some point we need some federal overlay there. It doesn't mean we would have complete preemption of everything at the state or local level in all likelihood. I think what's likely to happen is that there'll be some de minimis floor, or maybe ceiling rather, of how much regulation is allowed by states, especially in certain grounds that are clearly what are interstate commerce. If, for example, the state of California is trying to regulate everything that OpenAI does, or Anthropic, or any other major AI frontier model developer, well, that has spillovers across the entire nation. That's California essentially exporting its policies to the whole nation. And that's basically what the European Union's been trying to do with us for the last decade. So at some point, I think Congress does need to act, sort of normalize or level that playing field a little bit, and figure out where the states can act within boundaries. But right now, there's just such a runaway train of legislation that it has lawmakers concerned, because what they're really worried about is what would that mean to our broader competitiveness and our geopolitical standing as China races ahead, with so many of their companies starting to break into markets where we're not currently present. Question up here?
I think that's all well and good, but it seems fairly limited to think of it in terms of national laws. I mean, the scourge of our industry has always been infringement on our IP. And we could have all the legislation you want in the US, but as long as there are international agents, if you will, that are copying product design, copying, permits, copying architecture, copying anything that we're doing, it doesn't really matter what kind of national legislation we have. I mean, if you want to reference the internet, I mean, we already know that there are, bad actors out there internationally that have already hacked all of our systems. So
Yeah.
How does legislation nationally protect us against what's going on outside of these borders?
It's a great question and a demoralizing one, because what you're suggesting, is that there's almost like no answer to the bad actors of the world, and it is a problem. I mean, we know China, for example, the Chinese Communist Party has made industrial espionage a major part of their efforts to undermine U.S. interests. And we also know that they've engaged in various spying efforts. I tell you, the most uncomfortable speech I ever attended in my life was an event at Google where a national security officer said, "I'm willing to bet at least 5% of the people in the room right now that are Google employees are working for the Chinese Communist Party." And everybody started looking at each other like, are you the spy? Are you the spy? And it was like a terrible thing to say to that crowd. But the reality is that there are people who are embedded at various levels of industry that are problematic for national security reasons, and this has us on high alert. What you do about it is a totally different matter. Of course, the Trump administration is doing these trade wars at the same time that are trying to go after China. I wish it was mostly focused on China and not everybody else that should be our friends. Because the solution to the problem you're raising, the very valid question, is we need to work through multilateral or minilateral efforts to work with friends and allies across the globe to address that threat, and to work together to come up with some sort of common sense rules that the world can play by. This is what I started my life doing in the early 90s through the whole GATT and WTO process and NAFTA, and I thought we were on the way, and then that model's kind of fallen apart, and now everybody's kind of against it, and it's like every country for themselves. And that's not going to work for this industry or any others. If it's US versus the world, that's not good. Anything else? All right, thank you. Appreciate it.